Today, we're so excited to have Masud Olufani back with us, and he'll be speaking on America's racial problem from a Baha'i perspective. Masud Olufani is an Atlanta-based actor, mixed media artist, and writer whose studio practice is rooted in the discipline of sculpture. He's a graduate of Morehouse College and the Savannah College of Art and Design, where he earned an MFA in sculpture in 2013. Masud has exhibited his work in group and solo shows nationally and internationally. As a writer, Masud has published articles for Burnaway, Baha'i Teachings, and is a featured contributor for the Jacob Lawrence Struggle Series catalog, produced to coincide with a major exhibition of the Struggle Series paintings. And with that, I'll hand it off to Masud.
Good early afternoon, everybody. Good to see you all. Glad to be with you. I am a little bit really heavily stressed today because I have 3 talks back to back. So we're going to get through this with as efficiently as we possibly can. I am wholly committed to being with you all present in mind, body, and spirit for the hour and 50 minutes or so that I have to spend with you. So I'm very happy to be here with you today. Of course, we're having this discussion, or the thoughts that I have about the issue of race, I'm sharing in light of the July 22nd letter from the Universal House of Justice, where it describes the issue of race as a profound deviation of human morality. And as I'm sure we all have been doing, reading through the letter, I'm sure many of us have studied the letter intently, have committed different passages of the letter to memory, and continue to reflect and study upon it. The profound implications, both for ourselves individually, but also collectively as a society, as an American society, and indeed as a human family around the globe. And as we're embarking on this conversation, which really is a sharing, I am thinking that for myself, when I'm discussing the issue of race, I like to take it out of the kind of macro and bring it back to how this profound deviation of human morality impacts people individually and how it affects them in very real ways. For me, that process, doing that work of transparency, of being open and honest about my own experience with the issue of race, requires a level of vulnerability and openness, which is a kind of contract that I'm entering into with you all today, where I am spending this time with you and I commit to be transparent, open, and honest about my experiences, and hopefully that'll give you some context about this most vital and challenging issue. And with that, I would like to tell you a brief story about something that happened to me recently. Indeed, last month on August 23rd, which was the Sunday in Kenosha, Washington, where Rayshard Brooks was shot 7 times in front of his children. And all of that, of course, was caught on video through phones. Now, I have grown up, obviously, born and bred in America, born in Los Angeles, California, raised in New York and parts of the Deep South. And the issue of racial violence is something that is not new to me. Indeed, it is something that is not new to America at all. Its roots extend all the way back to the time of enslavement and continue from that point on up until the present moment. Indeed, for the Black community in America, whose proximity to these issues of brutalization, subjectification, and nullification is very direct and much more close than people who are not within that community directly, but nevertheless share this kind of sense of oneness and brotherhood and sisterhood. And in my own family, on both sides of my family, there is a long legacy of racialized violence, stories that were passed down from generation to generation. You would hear them in whispers at family gatherings when the adults were talking in hushed tones. Somebody was lynched. I know somebody in my family who was beaten to death. Somebody who was shot for whistling at a white woman. So these narratives are not new in terms of the Black experience in America. And so I'm saying that to say that this situation, this incident on August 23rd, in and of itself was not a novel experience. And in some ways, the DNA of the traumatic DNA of those past experiences, extending some 401 years in this America's vast trek through the issue of racism in this country, form a kind of continuum of memory that live in the body in some ways and express themselves in really profoundly disjointing ways in some sense. So as I heard about this shooting of Rayshard Brooks, I of course expected in some sense to feel a deep sense of sadness for what took place. But of course it was a continuance of a lineage that, again, has been going on for a very long time. And I was terribly surprised to find myself having a visceral physical reaction to the shooting in ways that I have never experienced before. I spoke to a brother of mine, a white brother who happened to spend some time in Vietnam, and he talked about his experience of post-traumatic disorder as a result of being in war. And I was describing the feelings that I was having in the wake of this shooting. And I don't know, maybe it was the circumstances of how it happened. The fact that this man was shot 7 times in his back in front of his 3 children, and the pulling of the trigger again and again and again as those bullets invaded his body to cause irreparable damage. I could not eat. I could not sleep. I was filled with a deep sense of anxiety. I did not want to leave my house for fear that something might happen to me. And that is a feeling I have never had before. So that incident, those 7 shots in some way had invaded my consciousness and my body and were causing a physical reaction in a very real way that was impacting my life. And when I told this to my brother who would be in Vietnam, he said, that sounds like post-traumatic stress disorder. Of course, many of us have read the brilliant book by Dr. Joy DeGruy, Post-Traumatic Slavery Syndrome. And the hyper-anxiety, the sense of apprehension and fear, the living with a kind of double consciousness, as Du Bois talked about, this notion of living in a space and time as a person of color, Black person, where you have one face that you present to the world, but there is another face that you are carrying within to grapple, to deal with the series of traumatic events, the psychic traumatic, the physical trauma, the mental trauma that you experience on a day-to-day basis. And so as I was having this experience, you know, and trying to figure out what had happened to me, what was going on, and how I'd seen all these other violent incidents and how they had not had a similar impact on me. Of course, whenever something like this happens, I'm always sad. I always have a deep sense of something tragic has occurred, and also deeply personal because it is happening in my community. But nevertheless, this one was different, and it kind of echoed in my consciousness, and I still even feel it today. So I'm telling you this story to let you know that in some sense, I'm here before you today, and I'm sharing with you, and I'm spending this time, but I am struggling to grapple with this latest incident in my own life. So what you see before you is a man who, for all intents and purposes on the outside, is clean, well-groomed, educated, has been able to accomplish some things, but is also carrying the baggage, the legacy of that trauma within my body and within my psyche, and grappling to struggle and to deal with it on a day-to-day basis. So for me, this trauma, these events, as I'm sure for many of us here today, are not theoretical or intellectual. They are felt in the heart, in the core of my being. And it is with that context that I turn to the letter of the Universal House of Justice from July 22nd to hopefully provide you with a deeper understanding of why this issue, this most vital and challenging issue, is so critically important for us to grapple with, to wrestle with, and to ultimately overcome. Oftentimes when we speak about racism, we're talking about the systemic ills of racism, how it is expressed in terms of policy and law, how people are denied access to institutions, to bank loans, to better education, all of these things, which have a very real impact, a legacy impact within the Black community. But quite oftentimes we don't talk about the psychic, the spiritual wounds that happen as a result of experiencing a day-to-day onslaught on your body and person in this society, which is so blighted by the legacy, the illness, the cancerous malignancy of racism. And I think if we're going to enter into these meaningful conversations and develop these friendships that are enduring, we have to have these types of discussions, these transparent discussions that take it out of the conceptual and make it real. When I was a kid, like all children, I didn't have any understanding in the early part of my life of the idea of separations based on pigmentation, based on color. I knew that my skin was brown. I didn't see anything inherently wrong with it. I knew that some of my playmates had white skin. I didn't see anything inherently wrong with it. We were just kids. And then on a playground in Miami, Florida one day as a child, somebody called me a nigger. And I had heard this word. I talked a little bit about this in my talk in Arizona. I had heard this word as I sat down to watch the Roots miniseries with my family. I'd heard it expressed there, but for some reason, it had never been applied to me. I hadn't had experience. I was so young. And the first time I heard it, it was like somebody had taken a knife, if you will, and split me open in a way. And I remember being very angry, and I would get into fights over kids teasing me on the playground about the size of my lips, the kink of my hair, the size of my nose. And I would fight. That's the way I would deal with it. And as the years went on and I grew and I matured and I experienced, had my own life experiences, there were other ways that the issue of race was impacting my life that that was operating in a way, in a more covert way that wasn't as visceral and wasn't as out in the open as somebody calling you a name on a playground. But it operated more systemically. It operated, it was the subtle ways that people would diminish my capacity or my potential. It was the ways that I noticed that in my school where I went to in Newark, New Jersey, which is an historically Black area that has ties to the civil rights movement of the 1960s and also the race riots of the late 1960s, how the school that I went to and the students that I attended school with, all of which were immeasurably talented, had all of this capacity and ability to achieve and to make contributions to the world, nevertheless were diminished in some ways and were kind of thrown away and not valued for what they had to contribute. So you could see that there was some division, that there was some separation between culture and class within the society, but how we got there and how it was maintained, I was too young to understand. And then as I grew and I read more and I began to understand things in a deeper way and began to see how these systems of oppression operate, indeed how they operated in my family, how my family disproportionately is compared to the dominant culture would be considered poor. Indeed, for the most part, extremely poor. And how I looked around and I saw these members of my family who were hardworking, industrious people, who had dreams and aspirations. I had to ask myself the question, why was this the case? Why were members of my family in these financial constraints and the dominant culture was not? And to go through that kind of mental gymnastics is a very difficult thing. It brings up questions of self-worth It brings up questions of capacity, of ability. It brings up questions of, is there something intrinsic about my family, about my community, that makes us predisposed to having less when the dominant culture has so much? And so I began to ask myself these questions and to wrestle with them. And then as I began to dig deeper and to peel back the layers on the history of racism in this culture, I began to understand that no group of people is predisposed towards any behavior that places them so far behind in a race, if you will, that there has to be some reason, some systemic reason, something knit large into the structure of the society that is keeping one group of people down and another group of people up. And so I was able to let go of some of that internalized shame and that embarrassment, right? That comes out of a result of seeing your community struggling with the systemic ills of poverty, of joblessness, of hopelessness, of anger, of frustration, because I realized that in essence, it wasn't our fault. That there was a whole history of experiences that seeded the groundwork for this present condition. And so when I look at the letter from the Universal House of Justice on July 22nd, I'm looking at it in light of that, my own personal interaction with these realities, how it has impacted my family, how it has impacted me. And I'm thinking about this letter perhaps in a very different way than perhaps some others are. I'm thinking about it from the standpoint of someone who's experienced it, an interiority of that experience, seeing it impact my own life and the lives of the loved ones and those around me, my friends and family, my community. And so I feel a deeply personal investment in doing my small part to lend my voice to the eradication of racism here in America and indeed around the world. Robert Turner, who was the first African-American Baha'i to join the faith all the way back in the late 1800s, he was a servant in the home of the Hearst family in California. The Hearst, of course, the powerful publishing magnate who was the patriarch of the family. They made a lot of money in the publishing business, and they hired Robert Turner to be a house servant for the family. Robert Turner had been a formerly enslaved African who, at the end of slavery, there were very few opportunities available for African Americans to earn a living. One of those, of course, was continuing this pattern of servitude in a paid capacity, but nevertheless, that was one of the few ways of earning a living. And so that is what he did. When Abdu'l-Baha received the photograph of Robert Turner, and he wrote that beautiful statement about his countenance, how beautiful he was, how his dark visage was noble. And then he talked about him as being the pupil of the eye, the source through which light enters the eye. He set in motion a kind of series of events that would have a profound impact on the trajectory of people of African descent in this country and our place in terms of being at the forefront of leading a charge against racism in America. And we have to remember, in the late 1800s, we are talking nearly some 30 to 35 years at the end of the Civil War. We're talking at the end of Reconstruction, of course, Reconstruction being a brief moment of Shangri-La and true racial, a giant leap towards racial equality anyway in this country. And of course, that was stymied and thwarted by Southern segregationists who wanted to maintain a hierarchical power that was based on racialized hierarchies in the South. And so Abdu'l-Baha, who of course takes this position of being the servant as the primary way that he wants to be referred to. And we're told that, of course, he was referred to in many ways. He was called the limb of the law of God, the being around whom all names revolve, the ensign of the most great peace, This was the station of Abdul-Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the faith, the perfect exemplar of the Baha'i teachings. But for his own personal choice, he chose the station of service, of being a servant. And there, of course, is some identification between the Black community and that station. Of course, you have someone, the personage of Abdul-Baha, this remarkable human being who combines superhuman knowledge and perfection and all of the human, the things that make up a human being. They're blended and harmonized perfectly. So he is choosing the station of service. And of course, Black people come from the station of imposed servitude. And there's a kind of spiritual identification, a kind of commingling, if you will, a mystical conversation that the master Abdul-Baha is having with the Black community when he makes that statement about Robert Turner. And of course, this is happening some 70 years prior to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, prior to the passage of the Civil Rights Act, prior to the Civil Rights Movement, some 55 to 60 years prior to Rosa Parks taking a seat on a Montgomery bus and refusing to give up her seat, which sets in motion the Civil Rights Movement. Abdul-Baha is making this statement and saying that here we have a person of profound spiritual distinction who has a destiny, a legacy. This is your capacity. This is what you were created to do. It is a remarkable statement. And then we jump forward a bit as Abdul-Baha, of course, between 1911 and 1913 is traveling throughout the West, coming to America to share his father's teachings with the West, to spread the message of Baha'u'llah, the message of the oneness of mankind, the message of the equality of women and men, the message of the harmony of science and religion, and all these great spiritual principles. He is coming to bring that message to the West. And he stops in Washington, D.C., and he gives a talk at Howard University, an historically Black college. I was blessed to go to Morehouse College here in Atlanta, Georgia, which is an historically Black college for men. I almost went to Howard. It was a difficult choice, but Howard ranks very high in terms of my esteem and my fondness and my affection for the people, the remarkable people that it has produced. He stops at Howard University, he gives a talk, and then he goes to the home of a prominent Baha'i family in a rather plush area of the city. And a dinner has been laid out for their honored guest, Abdul-Baha, who has come all of this way, all the way from the Middle East to share his father's teachings with the world, with the West. And I can imagine as my mind, as my creative mind is taking this kind of imaginary trip to that moment, that the table is set, there's beautiful china, all of the napkins are perfectly folded, they've been ironed, all of the food is kind of laid out in these beautiful serving dishes. And the master, Abdul-Baha, says, where is Louis Gregory? Now, Louis Gregory, another graduate of Howard University and an attorney, was a member of the Talented Tenth, which was a collection of Black intellectuals, leading Black intellectuals and artists, which formed a kind of intellectual and creative kind of societal group in America. And he was considered one of those leading Black intellectuals. But nevertheless, he existed in a society that imposed a racial caste system where he could not go where he wanted to go. He couldn't gather where he wanted to gather. All of that was regulated by the color of his skin. And Louis Gregory had come to this home and he was waiting in the interior room. All of the guests, of course, all of them being white, maybe some of them being Persian, are gathered around this table prepared to eat their meal. And Abdul-Baha says, where is Mr. Gregory? And someone said, he's waiting in the interior room. Of course, that was the custom. Blacks and whites were not meant to mingle at the dining room table unless Blacks were serving whites. And then Abdul-Baha says, bring him in here. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think about that, the time of that statement, the fact that segregation was a deeply entrenched way of being here in America, the fact that most of American society wouldn't have dreamed of having a Black man join a table of white diners and being comfortable with that. It must have been like someone set off an alarm ringing in the ears. I can imagine the mouths of the guests who were gathered agape, people looking in starry-eyed wonder because they can't believe that he's going to bring a Black man in this room to have dinner with us. But of course, Abdu'l-Baha was not concerned with obeying social convention. His allegiance was to the transformative, the astounding, the redemptive, the powerful and illuminating teachings of his beloved father, Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Bahá'í Faith, and the core principle of that divinely revealed religion being the oneness of mankind. And because he was so committed to his father's teachings, he must have known, he obviously knew, that here lied an historical moment to demonstrate through behavior that this principle is not a theoretical supposition or intellectual exercise, but it is a living, breathing reality. And in this faith, at this moment, at this time, right now, everybody has a place at this table. And not only did he bring Mr. Gregory into the room, but he sat him in a place of honor. Wow, what a remarkable lesson for the world. Again, several decades before the modern civil rights movement, several decades before a prophetic and profoundly gifted preacher from Morehouse College named Dr. Martin Luther King would make his profound contribution to the elimination of prejudice here in the States. Several decades before, a man formerly known as Red, who would go on to become known as Malcolm X, and would take a stand against racism several decades before he would make his contribution. Here, this man from the East, coming to America, imbued, empowered, infused with the dynamic force of his father's teachings, saying to the world that at this table, everybody has a seat. And when I think about that police officer chasing Rashad Brooks around to the front door of his car and pumping 7 bullets into his body in front of his children, and I can contrast that with the dignity, the love, the demonstrable behavior affirming the inherent nobility of everybody, and using the most marginalized, the most dispossessed, the most brutalized people in this country to do so, I am profoundly moved. And this body, vibrating with the sense of sadness, the pain that I'm feeling from these recent racial incidents, the pain of seeing this brother shot 7 times in his back, the pain of Ahmaud Arbery, the pain of all those who have died recently, but not only that, the lineage of pain and suffering that has been visited upon Black bodies in public spaces. To see Abdu'l-Baha make that statement publicly, to affirm the inherent dignity of these people, is profoundly, profoundly inspiring for me. The July 22nd letter, of course, is so moving for all of us for so many reasons in the Baha'i community. If you're not a Baha'i and you happen to be listening in on this Zoom call, I encourage you to go read it. You don't have to be a Baha'i to read this letter. It's from the Universal House of Justice, the supreme governing body of the Baha'is of the United States. And essentially what the House of Justice is doing is responding to the recent racialized incidents here in America. And they talk about a moment of profound portent, excuse me. And I looked up that word portent because I wasn't sure what portent meant. And portent, according to the dictionary, means it has, let me pull it up, I got it right here. Yeah, So a portent is a sign of warning that something, especially something momentous or calamitous, is likely to happen. So a moment of profound portent. In America, the Baha'i Faith describes racism as America's most vital and challenging issue. Vital. Vital means important, but vital also points to the vital statistics of the body. A doctor can come into a room and look at a body, somebody who's laying on a gurney, and read their vital signs. What is their blood pressure doing? How is their heart rate? Do they seem disillusioned or disoriented? How is the body functioning? How is it operating? So vital in that sense has two meanings. It's important. It refers to, a societal thing, a structural thing, but then it also refers to the vital statistics of the body politic, of mankind, of humanity, of us here in the West dealing with this challenging issue. Challenging because it has worked its way, the cancerous malignancy of racism, into every fabric of American society. So it's challenging to dislodge, to disengage the legacy of racism from the institutions that it has so pervasively affected. Vital and challenging. The House of Justice goes on, they talk about how we are to be considered in terms of how we choose to expend our energies in helping to eradicate racism from the American society. It says that we're not to lean on these past modalities, these previous modalities, these ways of being as a method for solving this issue, that we have to think about it. So the language that we use, the activities that we choose to be engaged in, we have to be very conscious and deliberate about how and where we put our energies to make our contribution to the eradication of racism. Now, what's the buy-in for all of us if we dismantle the system of racism in America? Some people will say, well, it only affects people of color. I'm comfortable, I'm fine, I have a good life, I have a good house. My children are well cared for, my wife is well cared for. Why do I need to be concerned about that? The reason being, of course, is because if it is true, and I fundamentally believe it is, that we are all interconnected and unified by our primary identity, which is spiritual, that we are linked by a spiritual heritage that derives from God, from the divine imperium, that if something is affecting one member of that body politic, it sends reverberations throughout the whole body. That in some fundamental way, we are all interconnected in a very real sense. So the injustice that affects me directly also affects you indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. So there is an interconnectedness or interwoven of the fabric of humanity. And if you pull on one stitch, you are liable to unravel the entire garment. We're interconnected. That's the reality of our being. When I think of myself, I think of many different identities that make up who Masud is. I think that on the one hand, I'm an artist. On the one hand, I'm a writer. On the one hand, I'm also a performer. I'm a graduate of Morehouse College. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm also a Baha'i. Those are all secondary identities, however. The primary identity is spiritual. The thing that enables me to look at this screen and all of these tiny boxes and to recognize that these are not separate entities from myself, but these are absolutely, without a doubt, members of my extended family. The recognition that that primary identity is spiritual. It transcends all the secondary identities. Now, mind you, the secondary identities come with real world implications. So when I'm in public space as a Black man, I do have to monitor where I am. I have to be mindful of my surroundings. I have to notice how I'm being impacted by what my surroundings look like, what composes my surroundings, the way I have to act if I'm being pulled over by a police officer, how I have to check myself to make sure I'm not coming off as being too aggressive or too forthright. All of these things are impacted by my secondary, they're predicated on my secondary identity as an African-American man in America. So again, our work is motivated in this space because of our interconnectedness, our shared humanity, and also because the fundamental principle of this divinely revealed revelation is the oneness of mankind. So thinking carefully about how I'm going to utilize my energies. In the Baha'i Faith, the Baha'i world community is engaged in a process of community building called the Institute process. It's a very interesting thing. And I must confess, when I first heard about it, I wasn't so sure about the effectiveness of this line of action. I couldn't see it, which is not unusual. Something comes from the Universal House of Justice, doesn't guarantee that we're always going to recognize the efficacy or the importance of it. The point being is that we just try to arise and do what we can to lend our share of assistance to these forces. The community building process is about eliminating the sense of alienation and disconnectedness in our community by engaging in activities that build community and provide space for the establishment of meaningful relationships. What is a meaningful relationship? My best friend is a cat from Scotland. His name is Chris Scott. When I say he's from Scotland, he has a kilt and a sporran. He has the Scottish accent. He went to school in Edinburgh. He is a Scot. We've been friends for 30 some odd years. Most of my friends, up until the point when I met Chris, were African American. Having gone to Morehouse, lived in my community, most of the people I interacted with were Black. 1992, I heard about the Baha'i Faith. I embraced the faith after a long extended period of investigating the teachings, reflecting on them, interacting with other Baha'is. And so my pool of friendships expanded because the Baha'i Faith, the Baha'i community is pretty diverse. You have people from all over the world who are Baha'is. It doesn't necessarily mean that I knew these people, but we were associated because of our faith. And we talk about this whole idea of building meaningful relationships, the kind of relationship I was able to build with my friend Chris, that we've had for 25 years, the kinds of relationships that I've been able to build within and also without the Baha'i community. But all of that motivated and predicated on that idea of oneness. Meaningful means spending time with, getting to know, struggling to understand, asking searching questions, witnessing, being available, not just seeing somebody at an event, not just seeing somebody at an occasion, but investing in the relationship. And that is at the core of these activities that the Baha'i world community is engaged in, creating space, creating opportunities to build meaningful relationships. Some of these activities include children's classes, where we try to invest children with a sense of their spiritual identity, to help them to make wiser and better choices as they move forth in the world, to help them to understand themselves first as a noble being coming from God, right? Which is the larger part of their identity apart from their material identity. That the material and the spiritual have to go hand in hand. They aren't separate and mutually exclusive. They are actually interdependent. Junior youth empowerment workshops, where we work with young people throughout the community to empower them with the spiritual virtues and things that, and a sense of service so that they can move into the community and serve other human beings and create this space for building deeper and more meaningful relationships and create villages within our communities. Devotional gatherings, which provide spaces for us to come together as a community and to share in prayer and thanksgiving, to lift our voices up unto God, to turn ourselves over to the spiritual process, and again, to provide a space for us to build these deeply meaningful relationships. Study of the sacred text, all of these things, activities meant to build community. Now, when I first heard about these activities, again, some of it went over my head. I could understand it in some sense in theory, but I couldn't see practically how this was going to have a big impact. And as we're talking about ways how we're going to invest our time and our energy to lend our share of assistance to the eradication of racism, this is the main focus that Baha'is are engaged in right now around the world. What I learned through my engagement in this process is that over time, that relationships are cultivated, they are built through time spent, through welcoming people into your home. I'm talking pre-COVID moment, of course, now we're doing it over Zoom, but through opening ourselves up to difference and standing in those spaces of discomfort and dis-ease. You see, because it's always so much easier to spend time with people that you understand and that you know. It's so much easier for me to go around my family where everybody knows the cultural cues. I can say, yo, what's up, dog? How you doing? Everybody knows exactly what I mean. I can say, hey, baby, how's it living? What's going on, dog? They get it automatically. It's much more difficult for me to choose to be in a space where I'm not familiar with the cultural cues. To choose to stand in that cauldron, in that intersectionality of our humanity, but also our cultural difference. And to make the conscious decision to be present fully and wholly and not to run away when it gets difficult and challenging. One of the things that we often hear when we have these conversations about the issue of race is that I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to make sure that I'm really concerned that I'm going to say the wrong thing or that I'm going to offend somebody. And I understand in part where that comes from. But we also have to remember that discomfort is part of the process. The House of Justice says that there are two primary virtues that have to be employed in doing this work: patience and perseverance. We have to have the patience to be in these uncomfortable spaces and to make the mistakes that I'm going to make, mistakes perhaps that you are going to make. And we have to have the perseverance to push through. That, in essence, is the price we pay for the glorious inevitability of our oneness. So I'm less concerned, for me personally, when I hear people say, when we espouse the virtues of our interconnectedness and our oneness, that's beautiful, that's wonderful. But I'm more interested in what we do in terms of what we are willing to endure, what price we are willing to pay for this oneness. In the letter on July 23rd, the House of Justice says that the most powerful tool, the most indispensable tool in terms of overcoming this blight on American society is the transformative power of divine love. Love. When I speak about love, of course, I'm not talking about the kind of love that Shakespeare talks about, with full of its sentimental barbs and effusions of how beautiful a woman is and all of that, or a man is, and how lovely they look on a horse and all of that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a love that is grounded in justice, a love that is transformative, a love that allows us to make mistakes, to fall short, a love that holds us up and encourages us, a love that sustains us, a love that propels us to our best selves, a love that carries us over troubled waters, as the great singer Mahalia Jackson used to sing. Sometimes I sit back and wonder how I got over. And it's that kind of love that I'm trying to cultivate within myself, even in these difficult moments. It's in that letter from the July 22nd letter from the House of Justice that I'm filled with a sense of hope and determination in my work, even as I'm tired, as I'm exhausted, sometimes as I'm beaten down by the ongoing and continuous onslaught on members of my community. It's that love that carries me over. And at the end of the day, when I'm exhausted and I'm tired and I sit back and wonder how I got over, I look back on the force of that divine love. And that encourages me, that strengthens me, that carries me over those obstacles, that keeps me going back to build sincere relationships and community because of our shared humanity that isn't limited to my community, to my family, to my school, to my social economic circle, but that reaches beyond borders, tears down walls, and builds the beloved community. It's intentional, it requires courage, it requires fortitude, it requires transparency, it requires humility, it requires the best of all that we have. But of course, the goal is great. The ultimate destiny of humanity is great. And if not now, then when? And with that, I'm going to shut up because I've been talking too much. And I will love to open it up into, if I can, to questions. And if I can, I'll answer your questions as best I can. And if I can't, I'll point you off to somebody who can. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We really enjoyed that. And I love how you speak from the soul. Really is touching. So if anyone has any questions now, you can either put it in the chat and I'll read it out loud, or you can use the raise hand button, which you can find by clicking participants, and then it's in blue. We have a question from Alex, so I'll
Okay.
Hi, Masud. Thank you so much for sharing your talk. I appreciated both sharing a little bit, personally, as well as, what Baha'is are doing today, and Baha'is and friends in this community building process. And I guess I have a particular question about those who are engaged in protests right now, or who have been in recent months.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like these people, these souls, are especially perhaps ready to be engaged in this same community building process, because they both have the consciousness of the need to address systemic racism and racial injustice, but then they've also taken action. They've started to take action, and in some cases, they've even risked their own well-being. So it seems like they're really, perhaps in a sense, low-hanging fruit to have some of these conversations, these meaningful conversations, and to build relationships with them. My question is, how or what suggestions do you have in terms of going about that? How to have a conversation, perhaps about social change that goes beyond protesting, goes beyond looking at the system and merely trying to tear it down?
It's a big question because there are many hows. There are many possible hows, right? I think the how is predicated on building a relationship of trust. I think, particularly when you're talking about, the African-American community, the big issue for us, it's an issue of trust. We need to know that we can trust you in order to hear you. And trust, of course, is demonstrated through action. I wish there was an easier way I could tell you to go about this process, but it really is with the Black community, because the trust has been violated so systematically for so many years that it is difficult for us to open up and to be trusting. So an example of that, just to make this, to provide context, all right? So you can understand how I deal with the issue of trust. When I go to a public space and I find that I'm one of the only few African Americans in the room, my level of hypervigilance goes up immediately. I'm nervous, I'm aware, I'm self-protective. It is just a reaction that is in the DNA. It's very similar to a woman who's been in an abused relationship. If a woman has been beaten and she's in a room full of men, I guarantee you her hypervigilance goes way up. So it's a process of creating a relationship predicated on trust and demonstrating that you are trustworthy. And that takes time and intention. But I think once you've done that, my experience has been, then those conversations are open wide. It's like you can engage in those meaningful conversations because that trust has been built. So, and I think The Guardian gave us the best explanation for how to do this, right? He talks about what our brothers and sisters in the white community need to do and what our brothers and sisters in the Black community need to do. And so these two things need to happen concurrently, right? That ability, those actions that demonstrate trust and build trust have to be demonstrated to the Black community. And the Black community has to demonstrate a capacity to forgive, So those two things are interdependent. So my advice, my encouragement to you, based on my understanding and what I know, is to focus on the building of the relationship and the development of trust. And then your opportunities to share will expand exponentially in a deeper way.
Great. Armin asks, how did you become a Baha'i? I know you touched on it a little, but maybe you could go more in detail.
Gosh, it's a deep story. I was 1992. I was at Morehouse College, and I was dating a woman who was at Spelman College, which is the girl equivalent across the street. She was not a Baha'i. At the time, I actually was thinking about going to the seminary and becoming a priest. She thought that was a bad idea. She said, I don't think you would make a good priest. She said, but I have a friend here who's a member of the Baha'i community who I think it would be good for you to meet because the things that we talk about seem very in line with the Baha'i faith. I said, okay, never heard of the Baha'i faith before. Never heard of Baha'u'llah. So I met this person who is a venerated elder of the Baha'i community here in Atlanta. And it was through her that I ultimately embraced the faith after about a year of investigation and struggling with myself and with what was happening inside of me, which was this recognition inside of me of the truth of the writings. And then the young woman who introduced me to the faith, again, who was not a Baha'i, she left to go to grad school in New York City while I was finishing up my senior year. And then she got breast cancer and she died at 24. So for me, she was a gate for me to enter the faith. And she was an extraordinary young woman, talented, brilliant, beautiful, had so much to give to the world. I was just grateful that she gave me that gift in that moment and opened that door for me. So that's how I became a Baha'i.
Wow. Okay, I think Shahla is next, so I will unmute you.
It's a very heart-aching story, the story of prejudice.
Mm-hmm.
And for some of us who lived in North America in the 60s, we thought we had dealt with racism and sexism.
Yeah.
And we ran around, we marched, we burned our bras. We did the usual thing.
Yeah.
And then the 70s was the backlash.
Yeah.
And then 80s, we again did a few things. And the 90s were the backlash.
Yeah.
And we're marching again.
Mm-hmm.
And this time, we have more visual things. It's not any more story somebody tells.
Yeah.
We have seen it with our own eyes.
Yeah.
And I feel that time has come to really, really, really talk about it.
Yeah.
Because this is something we have learned to do, to be prejudiced.
Yeah.
It's in our culture so strong,
Mm-hmm.
so subtle.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's hard to detect until your kid grows up and then mouths something that completely shocks you and realize that, it's been around you. So I'm wondering, where do we go beyond the march?
Yeah.
How do we get beyond the march?
Yeah.
We have marched across to the Pacific to Atlantic, to Pacific to Atlantic over the years.
Yeah.
So we need to somehow, go beyond that.
Yeah.
So I need some lessons. We are little cocoons of Baha'i community.
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
we love each other.
Mm-hmm.
And we are protected.
Yeah.
And we're comfortable with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And we know each other's lingo. But how do we go beyond that? That's my question.
I think we have to recognize that you know, we're also impacted by racism even within the Baha'i community, that we struggle with it. That there is really no, that in a sense, there really is no us and them. There is only us. You know, I had to learn rather quickly that there's a difference between myself saying that I'm a Baha'i and my behavior reflecting Baha'i virtues and Baha'i teachings, right? So sometimes I'm better at that than others, but I had to be clear about what the goal was and what the distinction was, right? Obviously, most of the marching that we've done up until this point, and actually a lot of it that's being done right now, is about policy change. It's about legalistic maneuvering that will transform some regulatory way of being that allows for certain examples of injustice to endure. Of course, the Baha'i approach is much different than that, right? In the sense that although we recognize the importance of legal measures, ultimately it's the heart that has to be changed. Now that's that type of work, that type of soul work, that type of inner work is not going to be done through marching. It's not going to be done through a legalistic measure. It has to happen through relationship, right? Through consistent, through dedicated, through persevering to build community, one relationship at a time, community at a time, being committed to that. And I think it also requires us to be a little bit mistrusting of our devotion to ease and comfort, cultural ease and comfort, right? So if I look around in my community and the only people I'm associating with look like me, then there's a fundamental problem there as a Baha'i. Now, I'm not saying if you live in Iowa or some small town in West Virginia where your access to people who are different than you is not easy, that's a whole other issue. I mean, if you're not around people who are different than you, if your community doesn't reflect that, then you don't have access to a large pool. But certainly if you live around a city or a community that's diverse and we are self-segregating, there is a fundamental problem that is at variance with the spirit and the letter of the teachings of Baha'u'llah. So I have to be committed myself to going out and seeking those relationships, those diverse relationships, choosing to put myself in those spaces that sometimes are uncomfortable in order to build community and break down walls. And that's about changing the heart, because once we know each other, once you hear my story, once I look in your eyes and I hear your story and I see the joy and the laughter and the pain, I feel a sense of your humanity and I'm able to understand you in a deeper way. So some of those preconceived notions maybe I had before are diminished. They're torn down because now I know you heart to heart. I'm getting to understand you as a human being. So that internal work is really about, that enduring change is really about relationship, community building. So that's my understanding. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Okay, Michelle asks, how do we teach and share with our families that are systematically racist?
Whew, wow, that's a good one. You know, family systems are challenging. Family systems reflect culture. They reflect, you know, the social economic thing that's going on there. There's, you know, there's all types of things that are operating in family systems. And when you're a member of that system, particularly if you're say a child of the central figures of the system, being the mother and the father, it's difficult sometimes to create influence, particularly if the parents aren't open to the possibility that their child might actually be able to teach them something. That's just one example. But what I'm saying is I don't find anything as powerful and as moving as example, as behavior. So people might be closed to listening to what it is that we have to say or that you have to say in a family system. But I've seen and I've heard multiple stories of when children are exhibiting a pattern of behavior, if they're consciously seeking to do that and there's something ennobling about that behavior, the parents quite oftentimes will recognize that something has shifted in their child. And it also triggers something within themselves. So focusing on behavior, I think, in family systems is really important. And ultimately, the only behavior that we can control fully is our own. So I have also had my own struggles in my family. Black families, sometimes because of the hurt that we've endured, we can also be very closed sometimes. And I had to help. I think it wasn't Masud, it really was Baha'u'llah kind of working through me to help open up the family a little bit, to recognize that, no, we can't operate this way. We have to be more open, right? We have to realize that forget whatever the history has been, however damaging the history has been, that does not change the fact that we are interrelated as a human family. And we have to be open to that reality and encouraging the establishment and the building of those relationships. And I've seen quite a transformation in my family as a result of that. But it wasn't always easy. I mean, I heard the litany of things about white oppression and systemic racism. And it's a lot of it was true, but just the way it was expressed wasn't helpful. So anyway.
Well, what I have found is that a combination between everything that is going on in our world today has caused a greater divide within my family to the point, and I mean, I have to explain that I'm a 70-year-old great-grandmother, but my mother is a 95-year-old great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother, and she cannot understand, and the family divide has gotten to the point where there's little to no communication.
Yeah.
And like I said earlier in my comment, that this is my family now because they are the only people that understand.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very heart-wrenching to lose your family, but you know what you're doing is correct.
Yeah.
I mean, and I have for years, I mean, I've been in Baha'i for 40 plus years, and my family has known that, but I find that the further it is exposed, the greater the divide within my family. And I just bite my tongue because at 95 years old, I know my mother will never change, but yet I don't want to lose that relationship, So, and then here we're stuck in our houses, so it's so hard to go out and build new relationships.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Michelle.
But I thank you. And we have in our local assembly have been really studying these letters, and they are helpful. And I just, for anybody right now, I am having probably, the hardest time I've had. And I just got Fire and Gold, and I have to say,
it's a great book. A great book.
When I'm having challenging times, reading from Fire and Gold has really made me understand what these tests are that we're going through.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that somebody was talking about, we have, when Shyla said about all the decades we have gone through this, those of us that are older and burned our bras, we've broken down what's going on in our system down so far, but now we're at a point where we need to remove the foundation of this system of our society. We need to go down to the dirt and rebuild from there. And that's the only way it's going to, you know, if we just tear it down so far, we're just building on that old foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so it's going to, and we've been told this through the faith, we've been told this for decades, that this time would come. I never thought I would see it in my lifetime, but it's here. And now it's our time to teach people spirituality, so that when it's all done and over and we start rebuilding, everybody's on the same page and we're all builders of the new world. You know, whether they're Baha'is or not, we just need to teach people how to build a new world in a better way.
Yeah. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. Our next question is from Elga. I see you wrote it in the chat, but your hand's also raised, so I'll just unmute you.
Hello, everybody. So happy to be here, to listen to your talk. It's always very inspiring to hear from you, Masud. So my question was this, that we all are aware of, you know, the plight of the Black life in our lives, because we sure do not want that for ourselves. And a little experiment by Jane Elo, I think all of you know her. She's a leading educator in issues of racism. She did this little experiment. It's on YouTube. You all can go and look at it. That she asked a group of white people that which one of them will want to live a Black life. And she repeated the question, and no one raised their hands up. So she says, so you know.
Yeah.
So we all know what is really going on. So my question is, how are we addressing, or how do we really get down, in my own daily reflection, how do we get down to dispel this apparent dichotomy that we know, and yet we can claim ignorance, or even still go on with our lives as though nothing is happening? How do we address that?
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, I think, you know, progressive revelation is constantly about, you know, the development and the forward progress of humanity as a whole, right? And I think with each progressive revelation, we're being called to expand our capacity, our spiritual capacity, and to grow up, if you will, into fully functioning spiritually awakened and alive human beings. By revelation, this is the age of maturity, right? Where we begin to cast off the long night of our adolescence and move into a state of maturity. I think part of that maturity is about deepening our vision and our ability to see into the material and spiritual implications of our existence. I don't think it's ironic that Black folks in the Bahá'í Faith are referred to as the pupil of the eye. I think it makes complete sense when we think about it objectively, because if you think about it, so much of our existence, our successful kind of march through America has been predicated on our ability to read the landscape of our surroundings and then to calibrate our behavior based on what it is that we see. So it has been a kind of vision cultivated out of necessity, which has been made critical because of the consistent, persistent reality of existential threats that surround us. So that is an inspirational or an aspirational quality that all of us as human beings want to try to adopt, to develop within ourselves, is that ability to see and perceive reality. And that can't stop at my own immediate surroundings. It needs to be full encompassing, all encompassing of the diverse experiences that make up the human story. And I think an aspect of this, I think language is tied to this in some ways, because language reflects how we think about the world. But quite oftentimes people will think about things that are happening in other communities, and the language will follow this. And I think this is a kind of cultural mimicry that we have to get rid of within the Baha'i community, because it's not consistent with the vision of Baha'u'llah. But we'll say things like, it's a shame what's happening to those poor Mexican immigrants. So sad what's going on with the Black people in the Deep South. My, oh my, the poor Iranians who are suffering, who happen to be Baha'is, who are suffering under the Iranian government. And I think this language is not reflective of the higher standard that Baha'u'llah is calling humanity to arise to, which is this idea of our oneness. So I personally am interrogating how my own language reflects either my lower awareness or a less developed awareness, and how I can begin to shift my language so it reflects a higher awareness. So I don't want to talk about the poor Mexicans who are immigrating to the States. I want to talk about my brothers and sisters who happen to be of Mexican descent, who are struggling south of the border. I want to talk about my Persian brothers and sisters who are wrestling with the oppression under the Iranian government if they happen to be Baha'is, because that's my family. So I think if we begin to, one of the aspects of this is shifting, interrogating the language and changing the way that we talk about these things so it reflects the higher awareness and the higher consciousness that Baha'u'llah is calling us to. And that reflects a deeper awareness of our surroundings, our interdependence, how my brothers and sisters from whatever community they come from are being impacted by the inequities that exist in our society. So that's an internal and an external, that's internal and external work, I guess is what I'm saying, Elga, that I'm engaged in myself as I'm sharing this with you. I hope that answers your question. That's the best I can do.
Okay, so I think our last question is going to come from Zari. So I'm going to unmute you now.
Hi, thank you again for a great presentation. It was very compelling. I'm new to the Baha'i Faith. I found out about it this week, so this is actually my first time interacting with any Baha'is ever. So it's been very interesting just to hear about it. So I observed, Sue, that you have an extensive background in sculpture and art. So you're talking about wanting to be a priest, and somehow you ended up there. So I know we're running low on time, so it's probably a complicated answer, but to what extent do you believe that various art forms could serve as a unifying or uniting agent during these times for my generation and for older generations?
Such a great question. First of all, congratulations. So happy that that you declared and you found the faith, and welcome. Welcome. I think being a creative is so much about intentionality before you even make a thing. It's like, what's your intention? Why are you making the thing? Why are you sending it forth into the world? Whether that's a sculpture or a musical composition or a poem or a or a work of fiction or what have you, or nonfiction. So it's where I am internally in terms of my alignment with my principles and my values. Now, as a Baha'i, of course, we have a whole set of principles and values that regulate our way of being in the world, right? And so as I'm thinking about when I'm stepping into the studio, when I'm writing something, I'm motivated by, first of all, bringing context to human experience, but in light of those values and those principles, those teachings, which form the framework of my life. And I have learned over time to trust that, and that if I'm in that space, whatever I send forth will reflect that. And I think as the more that we can send those types of creations into the world, the more that that acts as a counterbalance to a lot of the garbage that is being sent into the world, where individual creators are not acting or are not creating from a space reflecting the higher virtues of humanity. So to me, it begins with intentionality, doing the work and sending that into the world as much as you can, and having that being a force of change. And, you know, objects, imagery, sounds, poetic verse, the written text, dance are powerful spiritual mechanisms for change. The writings talk about it. You know, the arts are as a ladder for the soul. So they have that capacity to lift us from one plane of existence to a next, to give us a deeper understanding and awareness just by their existence in the world. So we were in this meeting today. We prefaced that meeting by listening to a musical composition by Donny Hathaway. And I don't know about y'all, but that got me going. I mean, the pain, the poetry, the beauty, the eloquence of that voice, and also it being focused on the spirituality, just moves me every time I hear it. So that's an example of how that creative expression, how artistic expression can have a lasting and profound impact on the world. And so it's worth our efforts, it's worth our endeavors, it's worth the sacrifices that we have to make in order to send those incredible creations into the world, because they inspire the human heart. They get us to see things in a new way. And actually they can motivate change and transformation. So does that answer the question, Zari? You're on mute, you're on mute. You're muted.
Yes, it did answer my question, yes.
Okay.
Okay, great. Sorry I got kicked off there for a second.
Okay.
Okay, I think we'll wrap it up here just in the interest of time, but thank you so much again. That was a really insightful talk and following discussion. Okay, so our speaker next week will be Dr. Anthony Outler, and his topic will be Education for Liberation, a Baha'i Perspective. And these talks, again, occur every Saturday at Eastern Daylight Time, 12 o'clock noon. So please, invite your friends, and I'll also put my information again in the chat if you want to get on the mailing list. So now we're going to close with a song.
Let all associate, therefore, in this great human garden, even as flowers grow and blend together side by side. Love ye all religions and all races with the love that is true, true and sincere, and show that love through deeds, and show that love. Let all associate, therefore, in this great human garden, even as flowers grow and blend together side by side. grow and blend together, side by side. Let all associate, therefore, in this great human garden, even as flowers grow and blend together, side by side. Even as flowers grow and blend together, side by side by side.
Thank you again, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye, friends. Bye.